And we have people in this room from not just all 4 towns in this Windsor Orange district, but from other towns nearby. We have people listening from New Hampshire who are following our affordable housing conversation. And the fact that we're all here shows that as a community, we know that making sure everybody has a home is part of making sure our communities work. And we're here because we believe we can do it. If we didn't, we'd stay at home and watch TV. We're here because we're showing up for probably the most important issue facing the state, and we're here to make sure that we leave here tonight with very concrete steps to take action starting today, because this is what it's going to take. From the senior who wants to downsize and can't stay in their community because there's no place to go, to the young family who wants to be
recording in progress.
Wants to be helping to open up the emergency room at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, but can't do it because they can't hire, because people they offer jobs can't find a place to stay. This is all of our challenge, and we're in this together. And the fact that you all took your time on a Wednesday night when there were so many other things you could do speaks volumes about how we're going to come together and we're going to use duct tape and baling wire to fix this problem. So thank you again for being here tonight. To just give you a little context, we have people from affordable housing committees in our 4 towns who are here tonight. We have select board members who are watching. Again, we have people from all over the state who are paying attention, and I really appreciate you coming tonight and sharing your ideas and contributions at the end. I want to start by introducing our guests. We could have had some of the people in the audience on the stage tonight. We couldn't have more than 4 speakers because you would have been here till 10. So what we have is a representative cross-section of people who really inspire me, because they are people who believe that the challenges we face, and you know that Vermont now has the 2nd highest rate of homelessness in the country. You know that we've been told that we need something like 10,000 new units in the Upper Valley just to house the people who are here. And the people on this stage are people I really respect, because when things get hard, they don't go home. They lean in and they show up, and they look at data, they look at what we know, they look at what other people are doing, and they consistently are here to put new ideas on the table that can help us see our way to a better solution. The people here tonight are Neil O'Dell. Some of you may know Neil from his work with education. I'm not going to ask him to do much because he's been the one jerry-rigging the tech today. Neil is on the school board here in Norwich. He's also are you yet done at the VSBA?
Immediate past president.
Immediate past president. A lot of words in that title. But Neil has been incredibly instrumental at the state level in trying to understand the power of our education funding formula, but also how that interacts with the housing issue. And he's here to provide some pretty granular examples. I think you're pulling on both Norwich and Thetford in particular, but we'll let him do that tonight. But really appreciate the sharp, keen eye he brings to the challenge of making sure our communities are affordable. We also have Ann Sosin, and some of you may know her as a Thetford neighbor, but Ann is also a researcher at Dartmouth in issues around affordable housing and houselessness in Vermont, but particularly in rural communities. And one of the things I appreciate about Ann is the person who always says, this is a solvable problem, and there are very good examples in other places. We need to look at what those solutions might look like in the context of Vermont. So a lot of you reached out to me after the last session, really torn up about the fact that we aren't able to provide for everybody. Ann is one of the consistent voices who's been working on that issue. These are very granular analyses of problems. The other person on the panel tonight is Jeff Lubbell. You may recognize Jeff Lubbell from around town. And you may also not know, or may know, that Jeff works at ABT Associates, did I say that right? And is an expert in affordable housing and has done some incredibly interesting work that is looking beyond what we know as the challenges and trying to think around what solutions would look like, not just anywhere, but especially in the context of Vermont, where we are extremely resource constrained and we have significant labor shortages, which make building our way out of this challenge particularly difficult. But Jeff has a bunch of other ideas he'll share with us tonight that help you see some of the opportunities and possibilities. And it's important to remember that these are solvable problems. And Jeff is going to talk about some of the things we need to focus on to solve these problems. The next person is Mike Pieciak. He's the treasurer in the state of Vermont, a former colleague in the cabinet, somebody I have genuinely been grateful for throughout my career in Vermont at the education agency, but in state politics, because Mike, you always show up and you always start with what do we know? And when issues are hard, you are up there to listen. And as a result of that, you have also been the leading voice at the state level in trying to bring people together, unify us at the state level behind solutions, behind using the resources and the power of the state of Vermont to move those solutions that we know people need. I don't want to say any more because I know you're going to say it way better than I will, but we truly are lucky to have you. You've been bringing out-of-the-box ideas and you've been challenging us. When we say it's hard, you say yes and it's doable. And that's what we need right now, because as a state, we need to keep Dan DeWitt's open past 7. We need to know that if we're sick, we can go to the hospital, right? We need to know that when our kids come to school, there's a teacher there who can help them out. We need to know that when we're building our way out, we're doing it in a climate-friendly way. Because when someone is saying, I have to live an hour and a half away from Dartmouth because I can't afford to live closer, they're then driving 2 hours every day. They can't afford the gas, and that is certainly not good for our climate problems. So again, you have continuously worked across sectors to bring all those things together in ways that make for meaningful solutions for Vermont. So tonight, what you're going to get is a deep dive on what these challenges actually are, and then each of these speakers is going to give you a chance to hear what some of those solutions might be. We're going to let them have a little bit of conversation, then we're going to share some questions that we received online, and also have a good, solid 35, 40 minutes for you to ask questions and engage in conversation with these folks at the end of that session. Does that sound like a good idea? All right. I should have said, I want to acknowledge one other person. Jim, where did you go? Jim Maslin. Jim Maslin, I wanted to acknowledge, is my colleague in the House of Representatives. He represents our 4 towns. Jim has been incredibly generous in sort of taking me under his wing and bringing us on board. Jim also works on the Ways and Means Committee, and some of the solutions that you're going to hear about involve Ways and Means and taxes. And Jim is the person behind the scenes having some of those conversations and working that locally. And thank you for being here, Jim, tonight. Really appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to sit down, and we're going to start. Can you all see the screen? All right. We're going to start, and the first session is to get the speakers here to talk a little bit about what are the challenges we face and what are some of the solutions. And the first person is someone people sometimes don't think about as having a lot to do with affordable housing. But Neil, a couple years ago, the legislature changed the education property tax formula, as some of the folks in the community know, to make sure towns with a lot of disadvantaged students had more tax capacity. But one thing this did was sort of
microphone. Some kind of audio issue there. And they are having a hard time hearing you. So is it conflicting?
I'm not, he's a musician, I'm not. Sorry about that, everybody. Is that the mic or is it the Steve?
You have to turn
The what?
one mic.
Oh, wow. It's 2
One
mics. Okay,
mic.
Neil, hold your
There's
mic.
one
Let me
mic.
get the question out. All right, so one thing we've seen, and many people in Thetford and Norwich have been reaching out to me about, is that we are seeing that a lack of housing is driving up tax rates, and people are becoming aware of the housing problem through tax rates as well, and they're also seeing that those tax rates are accelerating the challenge of unaffordability. So can you talk to us about what affordable housing has to do with schools in Vermont, Neil, and what education has to do with affordable housing and what we can do about that?
Yeah, yes. And maybe
I'm
I
gonna
should
turn my
should I
mic
borrow
on.
that guy, or why don't I just borrow that guy?
Okay.
Thank you. And I apologize ahead of time if I turn like this and put my back to you as a, where'd my screen go?
Okay, they asked to stop hearing it, so
Oh,
we'll get back
okay.
to that. Sorry.
No worries. I mean, I'll start off by saying, so, Rebecca's absolutely right. I think when a lot of us think about housing, the first thing that comes to mind is not education. But we wanted to spend just a little bit of time tonight covering some of those connections. It's pretty intertwined, and I think most folks are probably not aware of that.
Is it keynote? I'm
Yep.
sorry.
That's okay. You want me to come over and take a look?
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Oh, there we go. All right. So one of the first areas that we actually, is pretty apparent to most folks is the staffing issue, right? And what you see here, whoops, back if I can. What you see here, just a sampling, 3 news articles that we've seen over the past couple of years related to our school's challenges when it comes to staffing, our ability to have sufficient and qualified staff with those kids on a daily basis. Certainly the pandemic had a part to do with it, but it's also this component of our housing shortage that's leading to a lot of schools having the difficulty of keeping staff in here. We're not immune to it here at Marion Cross. Just at a school board meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, our principal was telling us about the challenges of finding subs when our teachers are sick and unable to come into the building. We also know that there have been cases in Vermont of schools actually having to close for the day or shut down early is because they were unable to have the sufficient numbers of staff in the building to be able to take care of the students. So staffing is really just one area where housing and education intersect, but there are others as well too. And I want to briefly cover some of the school funding aspects of this and the taxation connection. This is a complex area, but I hope that if I do my job well tonight, that you'll leave with an understanding that caring for our schools means also paying attention to housing. So while the education funding formula in Vermont is notoriously complex, at its basis, at its core, the education tax rate actually just depends on how much schools spend per student. Vermont does the right thing by adjusting school districts that have a large number of disadvantaged students by counting those students as more than one. So what you need to understand is that when the tax rate is based on the amount of money that you spend per student, when you spend more per student, your tax rate is going to go up. So how do we end up spending more money per student? One of the ways that we can do that is if we actually have fewer kids in the school. So a school that spends $10 million and has 300 students is going to have a higher tax rate than the same school that spends $10 million but has 500 students, right? It's all because Vermont taxes based on the amount of money that we spend per student. So fewer students, whether it's through decreasing enrollment or also a change in student weights, is going to wind you up with higher tax rates. So we know that fewer students can contribute to higher tax rates. So how is Vermont doing in terms of student enrollment? So from this graph, you can see that things are not looking good. Back in 2004, we had roughly 94,000 students in the state of Vermont. Last year, 2023, that number was about 83,000 students. So we are seeing a rather significant decline in student enrollment in our state. And that's had an impact on how much money we spend per student. So the graph that you see here was pulled from a recent report from Vermont's Joint Fiscal Office. Those two bars at the top, the horizontal ones, the darker one just below that top line there, this is inflation-adjusted education spending in the state of Vermont. And the dotted line that you see on the graph is our decrease in students enrolled in schools in Vermont. So from this figure, you can see here that spending hasn't really increased that much. The increase in cost per student is really related to that precipitous decline in student enrollment. Since 2005, we've seen an increase in the average spending per student of almost $3,000. So I mentioned before that disadvantaged students are weighted to account for the fact that certain students cost more to educate than others. And a change to those student weights occurred back in 2022 when the legislature passed Act 127. For some districts with higher numbers of disadvantaged students, this means that they're going to see a benefit. Their student counts will go up. Those districts that have a greater number of advantaged students are going to see a disadvantage, a lower number of students. Because of this change in the student weights, the towns of Norwich and Thetford then are set to see dramatic increases in their property tax rates. For Norwich, we're looking at about a 19% tax rate increase, and in Thetford, we're estimating right now 16% tax rate increase. For those of you that have been around, well, I've been talking about this for months, if not a year now. You've seen me say different percentage increases in the past. The numbers that I'm showing you here tonight, these are prior to the application of the CLA. So if your common level of appraisal is going down, then your tax rates will be higher than the ones that we're proposing or estimating here. So I'm just going to sum things up for you a little bit. Education tax rates, and housing in Vermont are all intertwined. Our aging population means that there are fewer people in the same number of homes. This prevents people and families from being able to move into our state because there's a lack of housing supply. Fewer families moving to our state means fewer students in our school system. Fewer students in our school system equates to more education spending per student and higher tax rates. Higher tax rates results in increased housing prices. Increased housing prices changes the number of more socioeconomically disadvantaged families of being able to move in that town. When you have a more advantaged student population, your cost per student goes up and your tax rate goes up. The whole system feeds into itself. And I would say that if we want to make a change in this, it needs to be intentional. The system is not going to fix itself if we just let it go on like this. I've got a couple of figures here. I want to pass the mic back to Rebecca because we did pull some data regarding housing prices and also the split of homestead and non-homestead properties.
Just make it really quickly. I think it's helpful to contextualize and look at what it actually looks like in our 4 towns. And if you look at this data, you can find your own town. But what's worth noticing, this is the change in available homesteads, and homesteads are the places where people say they live full-time. Non-homesteads could be businesses or they could be second homes. Remember we said at the beginning, we need about 10,000 more units in the Upper Valley to house the people who already are here or looking to be here. If you look at Norwich, we actually lost homesteads. That should make us all concerned. And gained in non-homesteads, we don't know what those are, but we do know, for example, if you look at our grand list, that there's an increasing number of homes that are owned by LLCs, right? Businesses. It's a great hedge on the stock market. Housing is becoming a speculative device. If you look at some of the other communities, it's worth noticing that they have a slightly different pattern, but nobody is generating a lot of additional homesteads. So we have this huge need, and over that 5-year period, we saw no progress. And this is what it looks like. And when you think about this, this is the same 5-year window from 2017 to 2022. This is based on the grand list, and obviously there's some issues with the median household rate because our towns aren't that big. But what we see on average is that that in some of our communities, the cost of our housing is growing much faster than the consumer price index. It's escalating in cost faster than people's salaries and other sources of revenue are growing as well. So despite knowing about this, and despite everything that is said, this feedback loop is continuing to accelerate cost and make housing more affordable, less affordable. That sets us up for Anne. Vermont now has the second highest rate of houselessness in the nation. Can you tell me what's driving this crisis here in Vermont? Who's affected? Why does it matter? What does the research say? And what can we do about it? Sure. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Go ahead, Vince, please. I think Neil's got you there. I thought I'd start.
Is it, okay, you're good. You're clicking it?
Yep.
Okay.
I thought I'd just start by talking at high level about some of the very common myths on homelessness and what we actually know about the problem, and we can talk in greater depth about some of these points. As Rebecca said, Vermont has the second highest per capita rate of homelessness. Homelessness, though, is the sharp tip of the spear of our state's crisis of housing. And one of the most common myths is that homelessness is a crisis of unhousable people. We hear that a lot. And what we actually know, and what's borne out by a lot of research, and I really appreciated Mike sharing this research so frequently, is that homelessness is fundamentally a housing problem. It's housing affordability and supply, not substance use, mental illness, poverty, climate, generosity of public benefits, availability of services. It accounts for regional variation in homelessness across the U.S. Individual level factors can contribute to who becomes homeless, but they really don't explain the sharp variations we see from one part of the U.S. or another. And as Vermont's crisis of housing has grown, it's pushed more and more people into homelessness in our state. Next slide, please. Here, if we look at Vermont, so taking sorry about that. Just a snapshot, we see a growing gap between wages and housing costs. The National Low Income Housing Coalition put the price of the state housing wage, or the cost of a two-bedroom apartment at fair market rate, at $25 an hour. I've pulled a couple of local positions just to illustrate how hard it is for the people who work in our communities to live in our communities. It's a little bit hard to read that, but you can see child care teacher making somewhere between $16 and $27 an hour. A customer service associate at Hannaford's about $15 an hour. Beata, based in our community, home health aide, position we're increasingly in need as our population ages, $18 an hour. So it's hard to stay in this community, and more people are being pushed from housing insecure to the edges of homelessness as our crisis continues to escalate. Next slide, please. The second myth that I often hear, though, is that this homelessness is complex and unsolvable. We have no idea what to do about this problem. That's actually not the case. We actually have decades of research showing that the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness, including those who had experience with severe mental illness, substance use disorder, frequent encounters with the criminal justice system and our healthcare system, can be successfully housed using a housing first approach, so which means housing before everything else at its most basic level. We know that most people simply need housing. Housing is the solution to homelessness at the core. We have a lot of research on this, and when we look at cities and towns that are institutions that are employing these evidence-based approaches at scale, so not just for a few people or subset of the population, we're seeing really dramatic progress. Now, this requires a housing market that is not as hostile as ours. We have to work on our housing supply, but we know it is possible to make progress. Next slide, please. The other thing I often hear in Vermont is that this is not a Vermont problem. Homelessness is something that doesn't really exist here, and maybe even the numbers just reflect how well we count as the state. That's not the case. You've heard that we have the second highest per capita rate of homelessness. We saw another very dramatic jump in 2023. And by some indicators, we may be on track to surpass even California. This is a real problem in our state. Homelessness has largely been invisible. Rural homelessness often manifests as couch surfing, doubling up, living in cars or in crowded spaces. And what we've seen is that the use of some policies, including our motel program, has brought a lot of people out. It's given us a fuller picture of the problem. It's changed the face of it. It's brought it more into, it's made the problem more visible, but it hasn't created the problem. It's been there for a long time and it's continued to grow. We also are seeing an increase in unsheltered homelessness as some of the supports are taken away. And we're seeing this more and more in our communities. Next slide, please. We also often hear that homelessness is too costly to solve. We can't do anything about it because we have a lot of priorities that should come before it, and we really, this is not somewhere we can put resources. And what the data really shows is that the costs of unsheltered homelessness are incredibly high to our communities. Old estimates put the cost of unsheltered homelessness at over $30,000 per person per year. And these costs are absorbed by our health systems, our schools, our criminal justice systems, public services, and municipalities. We see that people become trapped in institutional cycles. They'll cycle between our criminal justice system and our health system, and that's incredibly costly. And sometimes we'll talk about this as a wrong pocket program. We don't think about it as an expense, but we're absorbing it from other places. We know that homelessness is very resource intensive for communities, and it's often not homelessness budgets that are absorbing these costs, but local municipalities that incur those costs. Next slide, please. The last myth that I want to deconstruct a little bit is one that I'm hearing a lot. People who are experiencing homelessness just need to work. And what we're seeing is nationally, the population of people experiencing homelessness is aging. Some data in our state would suggest that nearly 20% of people are 55 years or older, and that mirrors national trends. And we also see significant disability in the people experiencing homelessness in Vermont. One estimate from the state of Vermont suggests that people who are sheltered in motels it had up to 75% of households with at least one person with a disability. We also know and have a lot of data to show that homelessness and housing instability undermine work, that people have a very hard time finding, maintaining work when they don't have a place to go, to take a shower, to stay, or a stable address. And so we know that homelessness is not simply a work problem, and it undermines work. And others have talked about this as well. So let me stop there. Rebecca, and pass on to the next person.
Thank you very much, Anne. Jeff, I'm going to turn to you right now. You've worked at the federal level, you've worked here in Vermont, you've worked across the country, you've dedicated your whole career to expanding affordable housing for people who need it. Why is it important to have affordable housing in general and in Vermont specifically? And people are already saying it's too expensive to live here. I hear that everywhere. They're saying Vermont has finite resources, we have high land prices, we have a terrible workforce shortage. It feels like a lot. But how can Vermont be strategic to make the biggest difference as fast as possible on these issues?
Great. Well, thanks for your questions, and thanks for having me here.
1 minute. Should we turn off the slides?
Yeah, camera.
I think that helps the people.
Yeah, that'd be great. Can you hear me okay? So you define homelessness as the spear tip? What was the metaphor?
Sharp tip of the spear.
Sharp tip of the spear. I like that because, in a way, homelessness is the extreme manifestation of a housing problem that affects a much wider range of people, right? And part of what we've seen over the last decade, but particularly the last 5 years, is the housing problem creeping up the income spectrum and starting to affect a lot of people. It's not that homelessness wasn't important before, it is, and it's just, this is a problem that affects a wide range of people, and I think it's important to look at the broad range of the problem. So I've been doing this for about 25 years, and the thing that has really become clear to me as that, through all the research and all the discussion is just how central housing is to people's lives, to the lives of individuals and to the lives of the community. Housing is by in a defined commute around areas of job concentration. So we can debate whether that's 5 miles or 7 miles or 10 miles. Draw a circle around the most job-rich areas, and let's figure out how to put housing there. So what does that mean? Let's make sure that there's the water and wastewater infrastructure in those places to support denser housing development. Let's give those areas equal priority for affordable housing funding that we now provide to other places, right? Let's look at Act 250 requirements about, and make it somewhat streamlined to build housing in these areas that we really want them. There should be someone who wakes up every morning at the state level and says, how do I get more housing near jobs? That's not happening right now. Third idea, we need to think about how do we achieve economies of scale in Vermont. So this is one of the most important things that can be done to reduce the cost of housing. And in a big city, you've got these production builders. They're building 200 homes a year. They get huge discounts on parts. They have suppliers lined up. They're able to produce housing at 30, 40, 50% less than we are here in Vermont. Right? Here we just build 1 or 2 houses at a time. Why? Because it's hard. It's a rural area. I get it. So how do you achieve economies of scale in a rural state? You need to do it in a factory. Right? They have the ability to create housing in factories, both manufactured housing for a lower income population, but also there's modular housing. You can build any house you can build stick built, you can build in a factory. So we should be building homes at scale, smaller entry-level homes using repeatable designs, 200 to 300 homes a year. We should be building them here in Vermont to create good jobs at high-paying wages that are year-round, that will help us attract the labor shortages that we're missing. People don't want to work 7 months a year and then have to drive a school bus in order to feed their families. If you're a master carpenter, you want to work all year round, right? Do that in a factory. Do bulk purchase agreements so that we're able to lock in those prices to benefit, lower income people and moderate income people. We could, I think, really substantially reduce the cost and create entry-level homes and starter homes that people can afford. Just a few other quick ideas. We need to get creative in accessing land and thinking about where to build. We should be doing an inventory of publicly owned land in every community. We did that here in Norwich. We found housing that the town owns. We found housing that the fire district owns that's potentially developed. We should also be looking at the school district. So the school has a problem here in Norwich. Our taxes are going to go up. Well, Dresden School District owns a beautiful piece of property on Route 5. There are playing fields there, but there's plenty of room to build housing on that property and not affect the playing fields. Still have playing fields, but we can build housing. It would be on a bus route. It would be fairly close to sources of wastewater, and we could help address our problem that we have here in Vermont using the same land that the school district owns, right? So we just need to get creative. I would also encourage private citizens that have land to really think about donating it and making some land available. If you have 80 acres, taking 3 to 4 acres and giving them you won't even miss it. You won't know. And you barely even know, right? It'll be housing that people can afford. So the final point I'm just going to make is that we need to be strategic at the state level in our housing policy. There are a lot of great housing policies in the state. There are a lot of agencies that are working very hard, that are doing, I think, an amazing job. What we lack is an overall framework, an overall strategic approach that says, here are our goals, and here are the policies, and here's how all the different agencies are going to contribute to those goals. It seems like basic common sense that you would have this. To be honest, most states don't have it, some do, but Vermont should do it. We're a small state. We should be able to get around a room, bring together the 6 or 7 different agencies that have some responsibility for housing, and develop a strategy. And then we will be able to tell the legislature, this is what we need to achieve our goals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeff. Pass it on.
I'm going to use my teacher voice. Does that work? Treasurer Pieciak, hi. You have a unique vantage point in that you sit at the state level, you watch the legislature, but you're there year-round. And that's an incredibly important perspective. Some people act like these problems are inevitable and can't get traction. You uniquely decided to lean into it, and you use the power of your office to launch the 10% for Vermont initiative, which is using Vermont's resources, and I'll let you explain more, but to get some traction on this issue. Why did you choose this focus? And can you talk to us about what the state can do and what the state should do from your perspective? And also tell us a bit about 10%.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for all the other co-panelists. I think it's been a great discussion tonight. It's been great to sort of flesh some of these issues out. I mean, why did we get interested in housing? You know, I see Linda Gray in the back, and like one of the first visits we had in this 252 town tour when we ran for our treasurer's office was here in Norwich, and we met with Linda, we met with Dan and Fritz, we met with other local community leaders, and it was the first time we heard, well, you know, we don't have enough people to run the store, and we've had to go to this other model where it's voluntary. And I said, well, can you explain more about that? And they said, well, nobody that could work at the store can afford to live anywhere near here, so they have left. And we're seeing the same problem in our schools. We're seeing the same problem across the river at Dartmouth. And so that's really interesting. And, you know, it wasn't the same conversation in every other 251 towns, but it was a very similar conversation. And it would also include things like, you know, why, you know, what's going on in the town? The town clerk would say, I'm so busy, everything's so busy. I say, why are you so busy? And I said, well, we've had so many people move to our community. And I said, can you tell me more about that? And I said, well, you know, they moved here, they paid for their home in cash, they paid more than the asking price, they have a remote job, maybe they brought some kids with them and they're in school, but, you know, we've been doing so many of these land transactions. And that also was a repeatable story over and over and over again. So I got really interested in, you know, are these anecdotal stories bearing out in the data? And in both instances, they really were, whether you're looking at it from a, you know, a demographic standpoint, from an economic standpoint, or from a social standpoint. Demographically, data shows that people have been moving to Vermont in the last few years in numbers that we haven't seen any time recently. That's put pressure on our housing stock. They've also, the folks that have come have generally been higher income earners. They've brought more revenues to the state. Our state revenues have been going up. Like, that's all a good thing, but it's just put a tremendous amount of pressure on our housing stock. You heard from Ann, you know, that pressure is resulting in our really significant increase in individuals experiencing homelessness. There's a direct correlation and direct connection there. When you have communities that are experiencing more demand on their housing, you saw the slide before that showed like there were 8 new units of housing in the area. When you have areas that are experiencing increased demand and people are buying those homes, somebody is left without a home, and they're either going to move to another community, they're going to become unhoused, they're really going to have challenges having a stable and successful life. So that's a real issue. And you know, there are communities, though, that are seeing that kind of demand for people to move into their state, into their city, into their county, and they're responding with good policies, like a number of the ones that Jeff laid out, and they are having an elastic housing market. When the population goes up, their housing stock goes up, and they're not seeing the same kind of dramatic increased rates in homelessness. So it sort of sits at the center of that issue as well. It sits at the center of healthcare that we heard already, that when we have individuals who are unhoused, they increase the cost of healthcare. When we have nurses that can't afford to live in the community, and you have to turn to traveling nurses, that's increasing the cost of healthcare. I don't know how many people in the room have tried to get a doctor's appointment and had great success with that recently, but I know anecdotally when I talk to people, it's a real challenge in Vermont, the wait times to get into a doctor. Again, every level, a general practitioner, a specialist, a nurse, a hospital president, they're all stories throughout the state about people that have accepted jobs and then have had to turn away because they couldn't find housing even though they wanted to work in our state. So I see housing sitting at the center of our challenges. I see it sitting at the center of our economic challenges. I see it sitting at the center of our social challenges, and that's why I wanted to be involved in it, because if you're trying to sort of do a root cause analysis, I think the lack of housing sort of sits right at that root cause. The 10% of Vermont program that we expanded is this program that allows the Treasurer's Office to invest 10% of the state's cash on hand into economic development in the state. So we have seen significant revenue increases, like I mentioned, and that means that we have more cash on hand as a state. Back in 2014 or 15, we had $200 or $300 million sort of in our cash fund. That's now more like $2 billion pretty consistently. So we expanded that program up to $100 million, tried to be conservative. We didn't know, some of that money is federal money, some of that money might go away in the next 2 to 3 years. But we expanded it and freed up about $85 million of new dollars that we then decided we wanted to prioritize into housing. We thought housing was the most important economic development initiative we could focus on. And we also made the decision, because you heard Jeff talk about you need to make housing less expensive to be able to build more. So we decided to put the money out as low interest rate loans. So if you're getting a 20-year rate under this program, it could be as low as 2%, the amount that you're getting. While in the private market, that would be more like 8.5, 9% right now. And that interest rate environment alone is preventing so many projects from moving forward, let alone the labor increases and the supply increases that people have experienced since the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the first projects that this money went to support was a assisted living facility in Virgins. They basically were ready to go in pre-pandemic times, and the pandemic hit. And then when they went back to start building their building and closing on it, it was $5 million more expensive than it was pre-pandemic. And they were kind of were stuck, because if they borrowed $5 million at the current interest rate environment, then the project started to not look like it did pre-pandemic. It didn't pencil out in the same way, and maybe it made it non-viable. So for our money to be able to go in at a low interest rate and close that gap that has now been created following increases in prices that we've seen since the pandemic was really helpful for that project to move forward. And I'll leave it at that too, but I want to just mention one thing about that senior housing project. I think everything that Jeff said was really excellent and spot on, particularly around the need for thinking about manufactured homes and doing that in Vermont, controlling the supply, getting the scale, being able to bring the price down. The other way to bring the price down is to think about how do you create a regulatory environment that makes the most sense in terms of timing and in terms of speed, and not having duplicative regulation, so there's additional costs. So the workforce housing zones is a really interesting idea as well. And I should just mention, I always look at what other states are doing, and I thought that there was another state that was doing exactly what Jeff said about thinking about housing strategically and trying to develop a plan and bring all the stakeholders in. And I said, who's doing this for them? And it just so happened to be the firm that Jeff works at. And I said, oh, that's great. It's a big international firm, or national, however you want to describe yourself. And I reached out to the project team and said, is there someone I could talk to? And he said, well, Jeff, he lives in Vermont. And that was great. And I guess I get optimism from that, because we do have great expertise here to try to solve some of these challenges. But the one thing I just want to add to the list is a focus on senior-specific housing as well. I think of that facility in Virgins. It's for low and moderate income seniors, and they call it the missing sort of middle for seniors. And they're going to have a safer place to live. They're going to get better resources, better services. They're going to add 40 new jobs in that facility. But the thing I'm most excited about, and something that facility will track for us, is the 65 new units that they created. That's now going to free up 65 new homes, in the Addison County area for young families to move into and others to move into. So we can continue to think about building more homes, and we should, but by building more senior-based communities and encouraging that across Vermont will also free up housing stock along the way for others to move into. So that's one area of interest I just wanted to add, and one perspective I wanted to add that we need to continue, I think, to think about from a policy perspective, how to support more senior community living across the state.
That's great to hear, Mike. I've heard about that repeatedly in our communities. There are many seniors who want to stay here, but they can't downsize because there's no place to downsize. I'm mindful of the time, and I want to pivot a little bit because several of the panelists mentioned or used the words strategic and intentional, and I want to start moving to questions from the audience. I'm going to start with some questions. I got a multitude of questions related to wastewater, and I'm hoping we can put intentional and strategic together with investments in municipal wastewater, because that's come up, I would say, at least 3 of the 4 towns that I've spoken to recently, and probably the 4th as well. What makes sense here, and how do we do it? I mean, we've seen from the systems that were fixed post-flood just how expensive these systems are. We also know that they're sort of enabling infrastructure. Whose responsibility is that? How do we think intentionally and strategically about that? And I'm looking at you, Mike, but I'm opening to anyone who wants to address that. And then we'll take questions.
Well, just to give you an example, like there's a town, just unnamed town, but they have a need for a new wastewater facility post-flood, and $27 million is the price tag, and the community members that will serve is 1,100. So 1,100 people need that new wastewater facility, $27 million. So it is significant, it is expensive. And I guess my point I would make on that is sort of twofold. One, to think strategically is, well, where do we already have that kind of infrastructure, and then make sure we're supporting housing in those communities. And I think it's also to Jeff's point, which is where do we want more housing to be from a strategic perspective, closer to jobs, and then how do we support more, more wastewater and infrastructure in those communities. You know, the idea along the way was that affordable housing, if you're building affordable housing, the best way that sort of maybe the state could get invested is to help build the infrastructure for those affordable housing units. And along the way, all of a sudden now private developers have access to this infrastructure, and it makes their costs less expensive. So I think it is an area where the state of Vermont could get much more invested in, because it does benefit both the community, it can benefit affordable housing projects, but indirectly it can support for-profit housing projects. Instead of giving for-profit housing projects money directly, it's a way of indirectly supporting them while just supporting the creation of more affordable housing as well. So I think those 2 strategic ways.
Yeah, what he said, but also just two points. One is we have traditionally in the state looked at wastewater essentially as something that needs to come from the locality, right? We place the burden on the locality. Yes, they can apply for funding to the state, but it's the locality that needs to manage it. And it's just not feasible for small localities that struggle with basic governance, that have small staff, and that worry about these huge bills to take the initiative and do all of this. It's just not going to happen. I think it needs to be the state that says, where do we want the infrastructure to go? And so let's, for example, look at the commute shed of these job-rich areas. Let's have somebody wake up every morning at the state and say, how do I get municipal infrastructure in these places? What kind of program do I need to create that people can just sign up without having to do all of this work and having to figure, I mean, it's just too much for it to happen at the local level. We really need something at the state level. And the other thing I would say is there's a ton of federal money that's been flowing down for infrastructure, right? It's not like the state needs to come up with all this money on its own. There's a lot of federal money available. So let's not forget that. And finally, new development can help pay for this infrastructure. So you talked about subsidies, but it's also like it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's not like you're shelling out $23 million, you can get back zero. People, if you're talking about new infrastructure for new housing, people can pay to connect to that infrastructure they have historically, and that can help defray costs and extend the money to help the people.
The school district knows nothing about problems with wastewater.
For those of you who aren't from Norwich, every 5 years, the parents of this, or I guess it's every 7 years, the parents of the school discover that their children are playing in wastewater.
They've solved it. They figured it out.
So they say. I'm mindful of time, and we have tremendous expertise in the audience, so I'm going to open up the floor. If people have a question they want to pose to the panel, I'd love to. Excellent. I'm going to ask you to come take the microphone and give us your name.
I think I can.
Okay, if you can shout, and I may repeat your question, but tell us who you are.
And then more was pointed to the fact that shelters in terms of health. And that we know that the Medicaid program is both a joint venture with the federal government and the state. Why don't the situation for individuals who are homeless, who have mental health issues or substance abuse, why can't you more or less work with the federal government, with a project to kind of like fund housing through Medicaid?
I'm going to try to summarize that as we now know that basically housing is healthcare, and why can't we work together to figure out how to put these two together using the Medicaid funding?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm going to let this person speak, and I might even let Susan Barrett, who's in the audience, speak after.
So I will say that there are places that are doing that in the exploratory work to use Medicaid dollars to support housing and or services that are wrapped around it is well underway in Vermont. And so this is not an area where I have worked extensively in Vermont, but I know that there's a lot happening, and hopefully we'll see more of that soon.
I'm going to take shameless advantage of the fact that the executive director of the Green Mountain Care Board happens to be sitting in the front row.
Thank you for that. So I thank you for doing this to everyone. So I would say healthcare is paying for this right now, and it's not only Medicaid, which is our tax dollars, but it's also commercial insurance that pays for the healthcare and Medicare. So the hospitals, and I think you all talked about this, and the healthcare facilities can't get the workers to come and live. I'll say Dartmouth is a good example. I have heard numerous examples of doctors, nurses, aides across the board not being able to live here, and so they can't take the jobs. Then what happens? People can't see the doctor or the clinician. Then they have to wait for an appointment. That's happening everywhere. But healthcare, I know UVMC has built apartments. I know Dartmouth has built apartments. I know across the board many hospitals are using money to house people and their employees already.
Can you stay up there? I think, okay, yeah.
Specifically the homeless population. I'm not talking about workforce population. I'm talking about homeless individuals, people with substance abuse, people with mental health issues, who can benefit by Medicaid and the state. So this is purely about individuals who have medical issues and not workers.
So I'm just going to repeat that question, or you can repeat the question. I'm not sure people online can hear it. Okay.
So I know that, as I said before, I know that the state is working to draw down the Medicaid dollars for the purposes of housing people experiencing homelessness. And I know Michael Redmond from the Upper Valley Haven is in the audience and may be able to comment further.
And you're correct that...
we have people online, so I'm trying to be mindful. Would you mind taking the mic?
You are correct that Medicaid can provide service support connected to housing under a program called supported housing. And Vermont has changed its Medicaid state plan, which is going to allow that to be used more easily, similarly in New Hampshire. But you can't use Medicaid for construction, which is what I think I'm hearing you say. And that's not an eligible activity under Medicaid. And so what you have nonprofit hospitals that have incredibly large surpluses create housing, but they're doing it in a combination of surpluses from private pay and private insurance. They're not doing it from the rates they get from Medicaid. So while I think there is supportive housing that can work in combination with Medicare and Medicaid if there's a diagnosis of significant mental health. And that's being done under the SASH program in the state. And it's a model that could be expanded. But also, I think, go back to some of the myths of homelessness. You're dealing with a tail of the total number, not the bulk of the people that we would see that would qualify for that level of mental health, medical issues. But, it's not one, as we also say too, it's not one thing, it's going to be a lot of things that will work on this problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I would be remiss if I didn't point out one other issue that's come up. I mean, one of the challenges is building more housing. Another is keeping people in housing if they're already in housing. And I just wanted to call out, John Feldy, you've been working on an initiative with Jim and myself around community nurses and community healthcare workers, because what we're seeing is that there are many people who can stay in their housing, but not unless they have occasional support. And so one of the pieces, and this is what I thought you were going to speak to, Susan, is how do we build that social care infrastructure, especially given the aging of our population, to make sure people can stay in their homes, because once they fall out, it's almost impossible, and you've spoken to this, it's almost impossible to get back in. So that's a big issue. Are there other questions here in the audience? Again, there's tremendous experience in the room. Yep, please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
I'm Deb Shannon, I live in Norwich, and I have a question about affordability and the construction industry. The people who build houses want to live in Vermont. There's a huge profit opportunity for building in Vermont. What incentive is there for them to build affordable, and what pieces are in place to ensure that what they build remains affordable? And how is affordable actually defined in Norwich versus Burlington versus Randolph or Brattleboro?
Excellent. Lots of questions.
8 questions in one.
8. Jeff, you want to start with this one?
So, great questions. One thing I'd like to say is that there's a lot of focus on how to find affordable housing, right? There's a lot of different opinions. What I would say is that everybody needs housing they can afford, right? And a well-functioning housing market has housing at a variety of different price points so that people at different price points can afford it. And what we know in Norwich is that we do not have housing well, we do. We have housing worth $600,000, we have housing worth $800,000, we have housing worth $1 million, we have housing worth $2 million. What we lack is housing, for the bulk of people, right, able to afford it. And so I would focus on that rather than saying, it's 30% or 23% or 32%. That's just my personal opinion, right? So, but anyway, that's one thing. So the second thing is, we need more housing units. Whether the market rate or affordable, we need more housing units. And it's the overall supply of housing relative to demand that affects overall affordability. So I would say even if we get more market rate units, that would be fantastic. It would help moderate the overall supply of housing. At the same time, there's always going to be people that have very low incomes that are not going to be able to afford those units. So at the same time that we're creating the environment that facilitates building housing, right? Market rate housing, we need to build housing that's dedicated for very low-income people and has legal restrictions associated with it to keep that housing affordable over time. Vermont has been at the vanguard of the movement of the permanent housing affordability movement. Every unit that is deeply subsidized in Vermont is permanently affordable. That is like a huge requirement. I think that means 99 years. There are processes for ensuring that those units stay affordable, whether they're rental units or for sale units. Vermont has been really good about that. So we're not building enough units, market rate or affordable, for a whole variety of reasons. And one of the reasons is that we don't have enough development capacity in this state. We just don't have enough people building housing. And there are a lot of reasons for that we can go into. We don't have a lot of time, but anyway, I hope that anyone else want to respond?
I'll say one thing to Deb's question. One of the problems is within the state too, not having enough development capacity. Like in Burlington, right? You hear about this. Like in Burlington, you can build a multifamily home. It's going to cost you about the same as it does down here, but then your rents are going to be, 25, 30, 40% higher in Burlington, than down here. So it makes it more attractive to build in certain parts of the state because what you can get at the end of the day. If you're building market rate housing, might be more than what you get in other parts. So that's something that we have to think about and try to cut against. The other problem you run into is developers can make a lot of money on the new $3 million home that they're building in Stowe, and that might be a more attractive opportunity for the contractor than the multifamily unit down in Waterbury. So those are two real challenges that we have to figure out. One is like how to incentivize the workforce on affordable housing, and then how do you get it across the rest of the state and not just in Chittenden County?
Mike, I don't want to take too much issue with you. The job density in Upper Valley, we have the census tract with the most jobs in Vermont or within community distance of Vermont is here in the Upper Valley. We have job density that is greater than Chittenden County. We have housing prices in many cases that are greater than Chittenden County. So
This impending tax rate increase, if nothing else, creates a greater opportunity to continue this discussion and figure out where we want to go from here. If we do nothing, the situation will just get worse. More kids in our school helps. A more diverse student population in our school helps. Those things will actually lower your tax rate. But we can't have those things if those families can't afford to move to this town or if there's no place for them to come. If you want things to just stay the same, then I need you to make sure that you understand that you're going to have to pay for that. It's going to cost.
So the first thing I think I would encourage you to do is what you're already doing, which is just to educate yourself about the issues. It's just so important to better understand these issues, to come to forums like this, to listen to other people who disagree with us. Just educate yourself about the issue. Second thing is we have to speak up, right? We have to do something. We have to act. If we want to live in an inclusive community, we need to take action. So if you have land, that you can make available, come let me know, right? If you're willing to support, advocacy around creating wastewater system here in Vermont, let me know. We need it very badly. Some of us are thinking about creating a nonprofit to really advocate for these issues. If you're interested in that effort, let me know.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I would suggest there's a couple of books. Housing is a homelessness is a housing problem, which we heard Ann mentioned earlier. I'd recommend you purchase it and read it. There's another book called The Great Displacement that's talking about how climate change is going to impact where people live over the next 50, 100 years. There's another book called How Infrastructure Works. I'd get one of those books, read it yourself, to Jeff's point, but then also give it to someone, your neighbor, your friend, because I think the way we're going to change this is by changing hearts and minds. Everyone here, I think, is able to connect the dots around how housing is fundamental. But there's a lot of not in my backyard activity that still happens all across the state, and we need to win the hearts and minds of those individuals. So I would encourage you to consider reading those books and giving them to friends that maybe are more in that category. Then the other thing I just would think about is, we have, this is not going to be solved overnight. This has been a long-term challenge. About a decade ago, we were building 1,100 units a year in Vermont. That number is now closer to 2,500 units a year, and we've been ramping up, but it takes a while. But we're going to have other pressure on our housing stock. We have a relatively older workforce, 100,000 people age 55 and older. They're going to be looking to retire in the next 10, 15 years. Not all of them are going to leave Vermont. Maybe most of them won't leave Vermont. So they're going to be leaving our workforce, but they're not going to be opening a home up in Vermont, which is going to put even more pressure on our housing stock as we move along over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Also, the climate refugees that we've been seeing, I have no doubt that will continue to be a pressure point on us over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So it's a problem now, we got to solve it, but it's going to be something that lives with us, I think, for quite some time. So we got to kind of make sure we frame it in that way, because we want to make sure we make progress on it over the long term.
So now, first of all, you can give yourselves applause. Thank you to you. I think those of us who work at the state level, we have deep gratitude to you because, first of all, you have given us so many good ideas. And I think Jim would agree with me that we learn a lot from hearing from you. I think we are richer tonight from the perspective and the ideas that have been shared. That is also in this audience. There's abundance of people in this room who are working deeply and engaging. Don't give up. We need to push you. Jeff, you're right. It is a long-term proposition, but we don't quit when it gets hard because everything that's hard is what is worth doing. And the people in this room are the people doing the hard work that matters, and we're not going to stop. So thank you, and thank you all to the panelists for taking your time here with me. So please. On the way out the door, if you have not registered to vote in the state of Vermont, there are some applications where you can fill out and you can drop it in the town office on your way out tomorrow. Please, if you're interested in updates or recording.
More houses, just in general, seems like we're going to get out of balance more than we even already are. So, curious about meeting the affordable housing first. If that's possible. Take that?
Well, I'll take it. I'm going to basically steal everything Jeff said earlier. If that's all right.
She wants you to be here so you can.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. So, you know, the fact that we don't know, like, how many senior housing units do we need, how many first-time homebuyer housing units do we need, how many affordable housing units do we need as a state, how many market rate units do we need? I mean, that's the kind of thing you would get from a statewide strategic housing assessment and plan, and then you would be able to sort of track how are we doing relative to each of those areas where we need more of them, or do we have enough of them? So I really, you know, that's why I was so intrigued when I read about what other states were doing across the country in that regard, and think that we could really benefit from doing that in Vermont, because then at least we can give you an answer. I don't think we can give you necessarily a great answer right now.
I hope there's a theme. You're hearing the theme here. We need a strategy, and that's going to take some analysis. Did you want to speak to that? Okay. That's really important. I really appreciate the fact. And that's certainly, I think, an issue that Jim and I were grappling with in the legislature. A lot of hands. I love this. Who's going next? We're going to take the rest of this time for questions. John?
Yeah, I'm John Feldy from Norwich. And I looked at the planning and zoning rules recently. I didn't look at them carefully. I haven't a lot of familiarity with them, but I think I noticed a conflict in them that kind of is, each of us has kind of in our heart, and that is we're probably mostly housed, the people who live here, and we probably mostly like our houses, and we like our community, the way it is, right? And I think it's kind of hard to overcome that. So the zoning rules seem to say that in the town, the village, there are exceptions that allow more dense housing to be built, but that they have to be limited by traditional housing patterns. Am I right? It seems like there's kind of a built-in, the way we feel about it is the town should always look the way it does now, in spite of the fact that we need more housing. Can you explain that?
Since there's a lot of hands.
Can you let Jeff answer?
Okay. Oh, yes. You are the expert. Let's use the wisdom in the room.
Yeah, thanks. Jeff Goodrich, lifetime resident. Family's been here for centuries. For what it's worth, I've been doing this for 40 years or so, and more than 15,000 projects. A quick reference.
Close.
Can you hear me now, Linda?
No. I wonder if we turned it off. I'm just going to check and make sure we turned it off. Yeah, we turned it off. Hold on. The camera's there you go.
Thanks, Rebecca.
So I'm just going to show you. Don't touch this thing on the bottom.
Gotcha. I won't repeat all that. Lived here for centuries kind of stuff. Anyway, I've been working on this for more than 15,000 projects in 40 years. I'm not going to chide any community. I'm just grateful that the regional planning commissions in recent years decided to work together to talk about this issue. Keys to the Valley suggest how that's finally happening. I think I would note construction costs from my perspective prior to COVID for market rate housing were in the range of about 150 to 175K per unit. The subsidized housing costs were north of 350K per unit. Today, I'm hearing from folks it's $400 a foot for construction costs. I can talk about the reasons for that. The basic, again, I'm not going to tell anyone what they should do. The basic issues before us are the regulations. Tim Briglin and Jim Naslin offered me up as a sacrifice to the Act 250 legislative effort that occurred a few years ago. And the net result of suggesting things like Jeff's talked about, how do we look at TIF districts, how do we look at growth centers, how do we look at incentives for Act 250 for affordability, et cetera, was not received well, and it didn't go forward. So fundamentally, what's governing the housing today is water and sewer. It's kind of simple. And our zoning and planning regulations from the local level to the state level. And the bottom line is until we want to actually accommodate what this issue is, it ain't going to happen. I've been trying to be a part of this issue for 40 years. It comes down to the law, what our legislators want, and what our locals want with respect to planning and zoning. And as Neil knows, I've been working on the Norwich wastewater issue in green, and there is a solution.
Let me just also respond to John. Thank you, John. Just want to also respond to your question. So you're absolutely right. We need more duplexes and triplexes and quadruplexes. We need what we call the missing middle housing, right? And the reality is you can build 2 units on any lot in Norwich. It's a state law, right? And it's not widely understood. And I don't think our zoning rules are as clear about that as it can be. But I don't think that our town is going to look very different if we build some duplexes instead of some single-family homes, right? I think there's a way to accommodate quite a bit more density without feeling like our neighborhood has changed. And if you look in the 1970s and the 1980s, Norwich grew by huge numbers of units. And you don't see people saying now, well, I wish things were, I mean, a few people do, but most people don't, right? People are, oh, I like it the way it is. Well, we had 500 units in each of those decades. Like, I mean, we could do it again. If we just have to set our mind to it.
For those who are interested in that bill, I did put the legislative report that Jim and I wrote outside, and there is a link, there's a little section there on what we invested in housing, but also on S100, which did loosen some of the regulations to support housing. Also made some changes that support housing for people who are unsheltered and unhoused in Vermont. Jim, I'm going to let you go, and then I want to make sure we get this question in.
Jim Maslin, representative from Thetford. Thank all of you people for your excellent presentations. I'm going to seem to go 2 directions at once. Does anybody here remember Frank Smallwood?
Yes.
A few. Right. Frank used to tell his Dartmouth students, government students across the river, that Americans are always hungry for the quick solution, but we implement things incrementally. And sometimes that is incredibly frustrating to us, particularly those in this room who want to see solutions right away. But the fact of the matter is, just because of the nature of the way our government works and our personalities and zoning and whatever, we do things kind of incrementally. So there have been a lot of good solutions pointed out here this evening, and one thing that I want to touch on is the notion, as John Feldy said, we could make some changes in our villages and you wouldn't notice it in many cases if people would just get their heads together and be a little creative. There are a number of dwellings that I drive by every day at Thetford Center that are single-family houses, and they're not in very good shape. And with a little creativity, they could be duplexes or 3-family houses, and they would look the same. They would blend into the village and be fine. I think there's probably septic soils there, and we could certainly get water. The point is, in Burlington and in Lebanon, we can do things and build many, multiple units at a time, and that seems to be going very well. In some of our small villages, we can build incrementally, and it'll go very well. What we need is, in many places, is just some initiative, some spunk, some common sense. Let's just go do it. And I'm sure I'm not being helpful to some people, but that's my short message for this evening, and I thank everybody for the multiple ideas that have been offered, because there have been many, many very good ideas. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more, and then we'll make sure Jeff can come in and testify again.
Thank you, John Jabrea from Stratford. Jeff, your number one point, the first point, that's your priority point, was to highlight where you characterize the conflict between conservationists and housing advocates. And you're advocating that they figure out how to work together or try to stop falling over each other or some words to that effect. And I'm just curious, can you take a minute to elaborate on that? Where do you see that conflict playing out? And what kind of resolution do you see?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that there is both a history of working together and there's also some challenges that we've experienced. My experience is just here in Norwich. We have tons of land that's been conserved. It's wonderful that we have all that land for conservation, right? It really is. But I've had people who have land in conservation who want to put housing on it and they can't because they're legally restricted from doing that. And even replacing an existing house, they can't do it because the legal restricted, the agreement was written in a way that prohibited them from doing that, right? So there's already a foundation there. The house has been torn down. They can't even put a new one there, put in affordable housing. It's legally restricted. There is land that is owned by a conservation organization. There are houses along the road everywhere else except for where this land is conserved. You could still conserve the field and put some housing along the road, right? Why isn't that being done, is my question. Why aren't we, like, when we do conservation, why aren't we thinking, are there opportunities for putting housing and combining it, right? We can cluster housing in a small portion of land, preserve the rest of the land. What I'm suggesting is we need to be thinking about these things together, right? Not that every place we conserve land is appropriate for housing. I completely agree. It's not. There's plenty of land it's not appropriate. But there's also, in my experience, there are a lot of conserved parcels that could have put some housing on it and still maintain the conservation value of that land. And we missed opportunities for doing that. And what I'm trying to encourage is more thoughtful coordination of these two communities and more thoughtful ways of conserving so that we achieve our conservation goals and also make opportunities available for below market housing. And that we create some flexibility in our system that doesn't tie our hands for generations. You know, it gives us the opportunity to say, you know what? We need some housing here. Let's conserve the land too. Let's figure out a way to make those work together.
So thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're going to stay around for a couple. I just know some people need to go, and it's been a long night. I want to thank everyone here and everyone online for your patience as we figured out the Persnickety Elementary School technology, which didn't work. We need some infrastructure. I want to thank you all. This is such an important issue. We need to stay focused on this, and the opportunities that are there are enormous if we can, both to protect our communities and to protect our neighbors. Mike, I'm really glad you're here. One of the things that we said over and over in the House Appropriations Committee is we need a plan. We need a plan. We're happy to help. We need a plan. And I just am really grateful to you for standing up and being willing to stick your head up, being willing to listen, being willing to come to our community on the other side of the state to hear what people are saying, because we need a plan. We need some strategy that's going to help us solve this problem. I want to just end by giving our panelists a 1-minute roundup. You can give them applause. I want them to tell you what your homework is when you leave, because we are not done. The work starts now. So I'm going to let them round robin from Ann to Mike, and I want them to tell you what you're going to do starting